It's a November night when destiny knocks at the door. Alexander Santamaria, 58 years old, worth $2.4 billion, is dining at his reserved table when he sees something that paralyzes his heart. On the wrist of the young waitress serving him wine is a bracelet he recognizes immediately. Diamonds set in platinum with a butterfly-shaped pendant. It's the bracelet he had given to his daughter Sofia on her 18th birthday 5 years ago. The same bracelet Sofia was wearing the night she disappeared forever. But how can it be on the wrist of a stranger? And above all, why does that girl have the same green eyes as his daughter? What city are you watching this video from and what time is it? By the way, if you're enjoying my videos, I'd be so happy if you could subscribe to my channel and like this video. The Royal Inn restaurant in Manhattan's Upper East Side represented the excellence of American fine dining, frequented by the city's financial and cultural elite. Alexander Santamaria occupied his usual table, number 7, the one with a view of the interior garden illuminated by dim lights. At 58, he was one of America's most powerful men, whose real estate empire extended from the United States to Latin America. That night of November 15th, he wasn't thinking about business. It was exactly 5 years since the day his daughter Sofia had disappeared without a trace. Every year, on that date, he came here to order the lobster risotto she loved so much and drink a glass of Napa Valley wine from 1985. Sofia's birth year. The waitress who approached was young, about 20 years old, with brown hair pulled back in an elegant bun and green eyes that sparkled under the restaurant's lights. She wore the establishment's impeccable uniform, white shirt and beige apron. She had graceful movements while serving the wine, but when she leaned down to adjust the napkin, Alexander noticed something that chilled his blood. On her right wrist sparkled a diamond bracelet set in platinum with a small butterfly-shaped pendant. Alexander immediately recognized that jewel. It was identical, absolutely identical to the one he had custom-made at Cartier for Sofia's 18th birthday. A unique, irreplaceable piece with a special engraving on the back that read, "For Sofia, my butterfly, Dad." His hands began to tremble. That bracelet had cost $200,000, but for him it was priceless. It was the last gift he had given his daughter before she disappeared, into nothing after a furious fight about her. Decision to abandon university to follow a boyfriend Alexander deeply disapproved of. Alexander stopped the waitress by gently touching her wrist and pointing to the bracelet. The girl looked at him surprised. Then she explained with a sweet voice that it had belonged to her mother, Elena Marchetti, who died of cancer 2 years before. She was called Julia, was 23 years old, and that jewel was the only memory she had of the mother who had raised her alone. Alexander carefully studied Julia's face while she spoke. There was something terribly familiar about her, the shape of her eyes, the way she moved her hands, that natural elegance in her gestures. And above all, those green eyes identical to the ones he saw every morning in the bathroom mirror. 23 years old. If Sofia were still alive, she would be 28 now. But that girl in front of him could have some connection with his daughter. Alexander left a $100 bill on the table and stood up abruptly, heading toward the exit without finishing dinner. He needed air, needed to think, needed to understand how it was possible that Sofia's bracelet was on the wrist of a perfect stranger. Julia watched him leave, confused, not knowing she had just triggered a chain of events that would forever change both their lives. Alexander spent a sleepless night in his penthouse in Midtown, pacing back and forth in front of the panoramic windows that overlooked Manhattan's illuminated skyline. The impressive view that normally relaxed him now seemed cold and hostile. Sofia's bracelet on that girl's wrist was like a ghost from the past returning to torment him. Awakening wounds he thought had already healed. Memories of the night Sofia had disappeared came back in waves. The furious fight over that boy she had fallen in love with. A musician without money whom Alexander deeply disapproved of. The screaming, the slamming doors, the cruel words said in anger that he could never take back. The last image of his daughter, beautiful and proud in her rebellion, with that bracelet shining on her wrist while she screamed that she never wanted to see him again. At dawn, with red eyes from lack of sleep and a heavy heart, he called Marco White, the city's best private investigator. Marco was a former police commissioner who had left the uniform to open his agency, specializing in cases the police couldn't solve. He had been the one who conducted the desperate searches for Sofia in the months following her disappearance, going through hospitals, morgues, train stations, and airports without ever finding a clue. Marco arrived at Alexander's office early in the afternoon, his face marked by fatigue from a night spent digging through digital archives and police databases. He brought with him a brown leather folder full of documents, photographs, and computer printouts that would forever change Alexander's perception of his life. The investigations into Giulia Marchetti had revealed a heartbreaking story, but full of inexplicable gaps. The girl had indeed been born on January 3, 2001, at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, daughter of Elena Marchetti, a woman the documents described as single with no known family. The father appeared as unknown in all official records, a detail that had immediately made Marco suspicious. Elena had raised Giulia alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of White Plains, working as an employee at an accounting firm. Her life seemed to have been marked by dignified modesty, but also by almost total social isolation. Elena had no close friends, didn't participate in social activities, never had lasting romantic relationships after Giulia's birth. When Giulia was 19, Elena had gotten sick with an aggressive cancer that took her in less than 8 months. The girl had been left completely alone in the world, with no known relatives, with only the support of social services that had helped her find work in Manhattan. But the discovery that had made Marco pale was hidden in a folder from St. Joseph's Orphanage in White Plains, where Giulia had spent some months after her mother's death. Among Elena's personal documents, preserved in a dusty cardboard box, was a faded photograph showing a young woman of extraordinary beauty. Marco put the photo on the table with trembling hands. The image showed Elena Marchetti at 18, and her face was practically identical to Sofia's. It wasn't a vague or imaginary resemblance. It was like looking at the same person in different eras, the same almond-shaped green eyes, the same slightly upturned nose shape, the same full mouth with that mysterious smile that had always characterized Sofia. Marco had delved deeper into Elena's life, discovering she had lived in Manhattan from September 1999 to March 2001, working as a secretary at the law firm Henderson & Associates on Park Avenue, the same firm that had been handling Alexander and his family's legal affairs for 20 years. Then, suddenly and without apparent explanation, she had moved to White Plains and never returned to Manhattan. Those had been the most difficult years of Alexander's marriage to Francisca. She traveled constantly for her work as an international consultant, often away for entire weeks, leaving him alone to manage his professional commitments and the loneliness of a relationship that was crumbling. Alexander began to remember with painful clarity. Elena Marchetti. How was it possible he had forgotten her? She was a girl of dazzling beauty who worked at the reception of lawyer Henderson's office, always elegant, always smiling, with a natural grace that made her stand out even in the sophisticated environment of the firm. Alexander often stopped to talk with her when he went to appointments, initially just out of professional courtesy, but soon those conversations had become more intimate. Elena was cultured, intelligent, had a sensitivity that Francisca seemed to have lost in the last years of their marriage. When Francisca went on business trips, Alexander began inventing excuses to pass by the office, even when he had no appointments. Their relationship had begun naturally, almost inevitably. Discreet dinners at restaurants outside downtown, long walks through New York's parks, stolen afternoons in Elena's small apartment in the Soho area. For Alexander, it had been an escape from reality, a refuge from the growing coldness of his marriage. But everything had changed in the summer of 2000, when Francisca had returned from Los Angeles with news that had disrupted everything. She was pregnant with Sofia. Alexander had immediately cut off all contact with Elena, focusing on his family and preparations for his daughter's arrival. He had never known what happened to Elena afterward. He had learned from the firm that she had moved, but had never investigated further. He had been too absorbed in the joy and responsibilities of impending fatherhood. Now, looking at Marco's documents, Alexander realized that if Elena had gotten pregnant in the same period and Giulia had been born in January 2001, this meant the pregnancy had begun exactly in April 2000, just when their relationship was at its peak. Marco had also made an even more disturbing discovery. The bracelet Julia wore was not the original that Alexander had given Sofia for her 18th birthday. He had personally contacted the head of private sales at Cartier, discovering that specific model, with that particular combination of diamonds and platinum and that butterfly-shaped pendant, had only been made 3 times in the brand's history. The first piece was the one Alexander had bought in 2018 for Sofia. The second had been sold in 2020 to a private collector in Miami who collected vintage American jewelry. The third had a much darker history. It had been stolen during a robbery at the Henderson family villa in the Hamptons on the night between November 14th and 15th, 2019. The exact same night Sofia had disappeared. Marco had obtained the police report of the robbery. The thieves had been professional and selective. They hadn't taken everything, but only specific pieces of great value, as if they knew exactly the collection's inventory. Among the stolen objects were jewels worth more than $2 million, including that bracelet valued at $200,000. The Henderson family, the same surname as the firm where Elena had worked. The same night as Sofia's disappearance, the stolen bracelet now found on Elena's daughter's wrist. Alexander looked at Marco with eyes that betrayed growing panic. The pieces of a terrifying puzzle were beginning to fit together, but the image emerging was too complex and frightening to be fully understood. Marco closed the folder and looked Alexander directly in the eyes. He told him he needed to arrange an urgent meeting with Julia, but that he should be prepared to discover truths that could destroy everything he thought he knew about his family and his past. Alexander nodded silently, knowing he no longer had a choice. He had to discover how that bracelet had reached Julia's wrist, even if it meant reopening wounds that had taken years to heal. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's continue with the video. The meeting took place in a small cafe near Central Park. Julia had arrived punctually, dressed with simple elegance, intrigued by the job proposal Alexander had made over the phone. He studied her attentively, noticing every detail of her face that reminded him of Elena and, strangely, also of himself. Alexander decided to be direct. He told her he had recognized the bracelet and that it belonged to his daughter who had disappeared 5 years before. Julia looked at him shocked. Then she confessed she had lied about the jewel's origin. The truth was much more complex. 5 years before, when she was 18 and had just left the orphanage without home or family, Julia was sleeping in Grand Central Station when she met a girl who was crying desperately on a bench. She was beautiful, elegant, with blonde hair and blue eyes, and was holding that bracelet in her trembling hands. The girl approached her crying and told her she had to flee, that she couldn't return home because she had discovered something terrible about her family. She said her name was Sofia and gave her the bracelet, explaining it was worth a lot and Julia could sell it to start a new life. But Julia never managed to sell it. It was too beautiful, and besides, it reminded her of that mysterious girl she had met in the darkest moment of her life. Sofia had told her she was going far away, where no one could find her. Then she had disappeared into the night. Alexander listened to the account with his heart beating frantically. His daughter was alive. She was alive and had chosen to disappear voluntarily. But why? What had she discovered so terrible as to force her to flee from her family? Then Alexander revealed to Julia his second discovery. He had investigated Elena Marchetti and believed Julia was his biological daughter. The girl looked at him incredulously, while he explained the secret relationship with her mother and the temporal coincidences that couldn't be chance. Julia agreed to submit to a DNA test. If there existed even the slightest possibility that Alexander was her father, she wanted to know the truth. And if Sofia was really her sister, she needed to know it. The genetic analysis laboratory was immersed in surreal silence, while Alexander and Julia waited for the results of the test done 3 days before. For Alexander, that wait had been agony, while investigator Marco continued digging into Elena Marchetti's past, discovering increasingly shocking details. Elena had worked at the Henderson firm from 1999 to 2001, and Mount Sinai Hospital records confirmed Julia had been born on January 3, 2001. If Elena had gotten pregnant in April 2000, it coincided perfectly with the period of the secret relationship with Alexander. When Dr. Fernandez entered with the results, his serious but professional face betrayed nothing. Then he pronounced the words that changed everything. The test confirmed with 99.9% probability that Alexander Santamaria was Giulia Marchetti's biological father. The silence that followed was deafening. Giulia looked at Alexander with eyes full of tears, while he felt as if the world were spinning upside down. After 23 years, he discovered he had another daughter, and she discovered she had a father who had been looking for her without knowing it. They embraced crying. 23 years of absence condensed in that embrace. Giulia now understood why she had always felt different, why she had always had the feeling something was missing in her life. And Alexander realized Sofia was not an only child. She had a sister she had never known, but while they embraced, Alexander couldn't shake a terrifying thought. If Sofia was alive and had chosen to disappear, she must have discovered something very serious, and the fact that the stolen bracelet had ended up in her hands couldn't be coincidental. Alexander revealed to Giulia a devastating truth that Marco had discovered. Elena hadn't died of cancer as she had always been told. She had been murdered, and he had the terrible suspicion that Sofia knew who was Elena's mother's killer. The office of lawyer Matthew Henderson was a monument to opulence with mahogany bookcases and valuable paintings. Alexander was sitting in front of the massive desk, while Giulia waited in the anteroom. Matthew had been the firm's partner where Elena worked, and when Alexander had discovered that the family robbed that November night of 2019 bore the same surname, he had understood it couldn't be a coincidence. Matthew served himself 2 whiskeys, despite it being 3 in the afternoon. Then he began telling a truth that would destroy everything Alexander thought he knew about his family. Elena Marchetti hadn't died of cancer. She had been murdered by order of Augustus Ferrer, Francisca's father and Sofia's grandfather. Augustus was a ruthless industrialist who had always controlled every aspect of family life with unorthodox methods. In 2018, Elena had begun investigating her biological family, discovering she had been adopted after her real parents died in a supposed traffic accident in 1982, but it hadn't been an accident. Augustus Ferrer had ordered the killing of landowners in New Jersey who refused to sell, land he wanted to build his first great residential complex. Elena had discovered all this and had decided to blackmail Augustus, wanting justice for her parents and economic security for Giulia. But Augustus never paid. Blackmail. He eliminated the problem at its root. Sofia had discovered that her grandfather had murdered her sister's mother. The night before disappearing, she had gone to Matthew's office, distraught and crying. She had found the compromising documents in Augustus's study and could no longer live with that family of murderers. But then Matthew revealed the most shocking discovery of all. Sofia hadn't fled alone, and Elena hadn't died in the attack organized by Augustus. She had managed to escape at the last moment, and for 5 years had been hiding together with Sofia. Alexander felt his legs weaken. His daughter was alive. Elena was alive, and together they were gathering evidence against Augustus to make him pay for all his crimes. Matthew explained that the 2 women were hiding in a rural house in the Catskill Mountains, protected by a network of people who hated Augustus and wanted to see him destroyed. They were waiting for the right moment to attack, when they had enough evidence to send him to prison for the rest of his life. Alexander ran to call Giulia. It was time to finally reunite the family that had been torn apart by years of lies and violence. The abandoned rural house in the Catskill Mountains seemed out of a dream, nestled among vineyards golden in the sunset. Alexander and Giulia arrived following the detailed directions Matthew had provided, with Alexander's heart beating so hard it seemed about to explode. When the weathered wooden door opened, Alexander first saw Elena. She had aged, her hair now completely gray, and her face marked by suffering. But the green eyes were the same, he remembered. Then behind her appeared Sofia, his daughter, alive, beautiful. She had maintained the same natural elegance, but in her eyes shone a maturity and determination that wasn't there 5 years before. She had become a woman, a warrior who had chosen to fight for justice instead of giving up. The embrace between father and daughter lasted an eternity. Alexander held her tight, as if he wanted to recover all the lost years in that single moment. Sofia cried silently, explaining through tears that it had hurt to make him suffer, but she had to protect herself and help Elena discover the truth about Augustus's crimes. Alexander turned toward Elena, who looked at him with a mixture of fear and hope. He told her he had never known about the pregnancy. that if he had known about Julia, he would have changed everything. Elena nodded understandingly. She knew Alexander wasn't like the other men in his family. That's why she had agreed to trust him now. Then Sofia turned and saw Julia for the first time. The two sisters looked at each other in silence for long moments, studying each other and immediately recognizing the family traits they shared. Sofia smiled sweetly and hugged the sister she had never known, explaining she had always known that someday the bracelet would reunite them. Elena approached Julia with tears in her eyes. The embrace between mother and daughter was something magical and devastating at the same time. 23 years of forced separation dissolving in an instant, but also awareness of all the time lost because of Augustus's lies. Sofia explained that now they had gathered enough evidence to definitively destroy Augustus. Elena had recorded compromising conversations, photographed documents, collected testimonies. Everything was ready to make the criminal empire that had ruined so many lives collapse. Alexander looked at his family finally reunited, 2 daughters he had raised and 1 he had lost. The woman he had loved and believed dead for years. It was a miracle born from pain, but now he only wanted one thing: to return home all together and start over as a true family. While the sun set over the Catskill Mountains, painting the sky pink and gold, a family torn apart by violence and lies was reuniting thanks to the power of love and truth. Sometimes the most painful secrets are needed to reveal the greatest joys, and sometimes a simple bracelet can change everyone's destiny. Did this story of family, secrets, and second chances move you? Did it make you reflect on how destiny can work in mysterious ways? If you also believe that family love overcomes any obstacle, that truth always emerges in the end, and that it's never too late to start over. Like and share this video. Tell us in the comments. Do you think Alexander did right to seek the truth? Do you think Sofia should have stayed hidden or returned to the family? Have you experienced any coincidence that changed your life? Subscribe to the channel for more stories that explore family bonds, past secrets, and the power of love that never dies. Like, comment, share. Because every story reminds us that family isn't just blood, but the love we choose to give. That truth can hurt but frees us, and that sometimes the smallest objects carry the biggest messages.